my baby gorillas, and I'm back at Westminster. So what was I going to talk to you today about with regards to the globalist agenda and why they're pushing slavery just now, and what happened in the slave trade and some of the misinformation, why it's been pushed, like critical race theory, decolonisation of the curricula. I don't know how you decolonise curricula. Does that mean we go back to Celtic times? Are they going to rename parts down here to the original Celtic names? I'm not quite sure. Is the English going to start speaking Welsh? I don't know how you decolonise the curriculum. However, one of the things that's been pushed heavily just now is slavery, and what actually happened in the slave trade. Now, there seems to be a lot of sort of misinformation and people who are not versed on what actually happened in the slave trade. Now, I'd just like to point out, I by no means am an expert in the slave trade and what happened in West Africa and what happened throughout the slave trade. However, there was a great programme called Roots back in the 1980s that gave an insight into slavery and what the things that had actually happened in slavery. So I thought I would just sort of give a wee sort of historical overview on slavery, the slave trade, and what has actually happened there. And one of the things that people might find interesting is that, as far as I'm aware, there was no British expedition, military expedition, or even from the Portuguese or the Spanish into Africa to actually capture slaves. There was no large-scale military involvement of European countries into African countries to basically enslave Africans. And this, as far as I'm aware, obviously there was malaria. The life expectancy of a European in Africa was 1 year. So people who were involved in the slave trade, the transatlantic transportation of slaves, were going down with malaria even on the ships as they approached Africa because of the malaria and because of obviously being infected. And so there was no ability for a European army to actually go into Africa and enslave Africans by themselves. So all of the West African slave trade, and I'll go on to the white slave trade and also the Turkish slave trade, the Muslim Turks slave trade, and the East African slave trade, and try and get a greater understanding of slavery and how the slave trade actually worked. As far as I'm aware, that it was Muslims, Muslim Africans and other Africans who enslaved each other and sold the slaves as slaves in exchange for goods and other products that were coming. So the people from Western Europe who were involved in the slave trades were actually traders. Now, the morality of buying people, I think we all can find objectionable just now, and enslaving people is objectionable. But as far as we're aware, that there was no military involvement, no army was sent to actually capture and enslave Africans for the transatlantic slave trade. And the people who were doing the enslaving and selling the slaves for profit were actually other Africans who, predating the transatlantic slave trade, had already been heavily involved in profiteering from the enslavement of other Africans in Africa. If you look back even as far as the Bible, and obviously the Bible is probably not a historically accurate piece of documentation, there was obviously slaves talked about back in the African slave trade. In the pre-biblical slave trade, pre-Jesus slave trade in Africa. So, and that obviously predates Islam as well. So there was already slavery in Africa. I don't think in Scotland, unless it was like Vikings come over and taking people back with them, or the Romans as well who had invaded Scotland, that these people were actually involved in the enslavement of people. But I think there was more a sort of indentured sort of servitude in Scotland more than an actual slave trade. And obviously slavery had been outlawed in the UK, so there's a lot of people in the UK will not actually have dealt with any aspect of slavery. So the vast majority of these people were not involved in slavery. They've never had any aspect of slavery brought to them, with the exception of obviously the transportation of slaves, and obviously slave owners being in what is now other countries just now. So the people who were tobacco barons were always seen as traders and almost entrepreneurs, although they did have slaves and were slave owners. But the people who had already been sold as slaves by Africans and Muslims in Africa were already enslaved by Africans and Muslims. But the other thing that I think people don't understand with the slave trade as well is that there was, I think, an African gentleman, or an African American gentleman, who was the first person, I think it was in Alabama, to actually go through a legislative process to actually own slaves. And as far as I was aware, I've heard the figure, and I'm not an expert in this at all, on West African and American slave trading, or slave owning even, that there was up to 1,000 African Americans that were slave owners in America as well. So it's not just the fact that the Africans and the Muslims in Africa enslaved the people, sold them as slaves, but on the other side there were slave owners in America who were of African origin, obviously going from the slave ownership to America. They were then again, some of them were actually owning slaves over there, and that's something that's not taken into consideration just now, that other Africans were enslaving other Africans and owners of slaves in what is now Western countries, independent Western countries. So that's and I don't know how that would be reflected in any what is called reparations to people who aren't slaves just now, and their ancestry may have sold them as slaves and actually been slave owners in the West as well. So these things are obviously inconvenient truths that people do not want to talk about, which is quite an incredible thing. So, but what they want to paint it as just a black and white. They've got this whiteness, which is just racism against white people, this sort of collectivisation of people who were never slave owners. I don't know of any of my ancestry that was involved in the slave trade. I think the vast majority of people in Scotland and in the UK had no involvement in the slave trade. There were specific people who were involved in this trade, which was a trade, because the goods were taken to Africa and exchanged or sold for slaves, and that's what the exchange was. Now, is this morally reprehensible behaviour? Yes, but I think we have to take on board that the enslavers and the slave sellers were all either African or Muslim, or African Muslims, even in the actual slave trade itself. But why is the globalist pushing the white guilt trick as well? Well, obviously, there's been figures of £14 billion being floated about. And I don't know how, if somebody was of African American and they were a slave owner, would they be getting recompensed by somebody who was white, who even family could have fought against the slave trade, actually physically fought against it in America? Would they be actually getting reparations as well? So, I mean, that's absolutely incredible. And we're also now seeing, obviously, in Libya, that there's still an Islamic slave trade where non-Muslims are being enslaved by Muslims and in Libya. So, I mean, obviously, these are the sort of things that are questionable. But the reason is, obviously, the globalists want mass immigration. And if they're using the slave trade to push their agenda, obviously in here, even after the rape of children in Rochdale, the people who were convicted of the rape and the pimping out of underage, under 16 children, who one of them said the things they did wasn't that bad. Obviously, from an Islamic point of view, obviously if your prophet was involved in this as a sexual slave trader and somebody who advanced raping of women who were non-Muslims, not in the cult, then that would be a big issue. But I mean, we've already seen the predating the transatlantic slave trade, the white slave trade that was done by the Muslims from Africa. In fact, if you even go back to the Hannibal and the Teutonic Wars against Rome, the invasion of Africans into Europe, into Spain, predates any invasion from European into Africa. So that sort of colonialisation actually happened from Africa. And I don't know if the Africans are going to pay reparations on the white slave trade, which actually took millions of people from Europe as well. There were people getting picked up from Ireland and parts of the UK, and as far as up as Iceland, that people were being actually taken on boats, and they were literally being captured and taken away. And then you've got the East African slave trade, where men were being castrated, and they were actually brought into East Africa from East Africa into the Middle East to be slaves. Millions and millions of people. Still going on to this day, to a lesser extent as well. We can see what's happening in Nigeria, as we were talking to the Nigerians, that these children are, the schools are being raided, and the children are being Islamised. So it's still going on today, because obviously the foundations of Islam allows that. And then we've got the Turks' invasion of Europe as well, where the harems, they used to enslave women and take them back to the harems. And then you've got the Janissaries that were all killed, who were enslaved Europeans that were converted to Islam and then told how to fight against the Europeans, the fellow brothers and sisters after the Islamisation, who were eventually all killed by the Ottomans. And obviously the Prophet Muhammad himself was a sexual slave trader, and the promotion of slavery, post-dating or the dating with regards to the introduction of Islam in Africa, the whole of this actually happened. But there was also slavery from Africa predating that. Obviously there was slavery in other places as well. I think even as far back as the Romans, predating the Romans as well, there was slaves involved. So what's the fixation by the globalists on just now, every time, the predate actually on slavery just now? Well, obviously, if they're talking about £14 trillion or dollars or whatever it is in slavery compensation, then that allows white people, white Europeans who are part of the globalist cabal, to take money off people who were never slave owners, pay for people who were never slaves. I mean, that means that I don't know if we're going to be able to take money from invasions that had happened into Scotland or parts of the UK, whether we're going to decolonialise the curriculum to a Celtic time in the origins of what is now called England, the land of the Angles, which I think is Germans basically. Although I would suggest that probably a large number of people who are in England are actually of Celtic descent, or even some that see themselves as English are actually part Celtic. So, and obviously we've been colonised because we're obviously speaking English, Germanic language, and not a Celtic language, whether it be Welsh or Breton or even Irish for that matter. So, I mean, all these things are now in the lap of God, but what is actually happening is we have now seen the mass importation of people. And if you look under the UN's Declaration on Genocide, where you actually displace through a political means the population, that's seen or prevent it actually getting on, that could be actually seen as genocide under international law. And as we can see with Priti Patel, we're not getting rid of even terrorists, never mind illegal immigrants, never mind people who are actually raping our children from a Muslim background in Scotland, in Scotland as well. When I talk to Sarwar, in Scotland or down in England, they're not even being deported, and we can see that this is happening back in the country of origin where they come to non-Muslims over there as well. So, I mean, it's absolutely huge. So, 14 trillion, I think the first black billionaire, I think he was a media mogul in America, is also calling for reparations. So, people who didn't have been whiteness, this whiteness thing that they're talking about, just racism. And I think it's what whiteness means is liberalism, and what they call as blackness. That's why it doesn't go on de facto racial grounds. It's basically the communists who are against the liberal democracies, freedom and liberal democracies, are now pushing this whiteness agenda, and by being openly racist and anti-white as well. And Nicola Sturgeon is obviously as well wanting to bring in critical race theory into the Scottish curriculum, where people who have emigrated to Scotland are now trying to push this anti-white racist agenda. There was a child killed in America, a white child killed by two black foster parents. She was beaten to death. A lot of them had the white privilege thing, and these two people beat this white child to death. And it was never actually spoken about. It's never spoken about in the media. Obviously, the media is controlled by 6 individuals. The big tech is controlled. They have a meeting to coordinate their advances as well, to stifle competition, to prevent new entrants into the market, to corporatism basically, and then to push this agenda where £14 trillion to take off people based on their skin colour, to give to people of the other skin colour, not based on any historical accuracies, because it would be very difficult to actually do that. But we've already seen in America that Joe Biden wants to push only people who have a specific skin colour. The racist Democrats are now pushing that sort of agenda again, which obviously we were involved in the Ku Klux Klan and all other aspects of racism in America as well, yet highly supported by the black community. I mean, it's like Stockholm Syndrome. But yeah, we're now obviously seeing the pushing of Islam in the UK by the globalists, by the fact that people are not being deported. Not only are they not being deported, when I was held in a Muslim country, allowed to starve for 2 years after being assaulted by a Muslim, the British government couldn't even actually give me any humanitarian assistance through the embassies over there, which I made myself known to the embassy, that they wouldn't actually even give me humanitarian assistance. So if a British person is in a Muslim country, they don't get any humanitarian assistance. But if we're over here, terrorists and people who are raping children are not going to be deported. Yeah, I'm deported after being assaulted by one of their taxi drivers. And the taxi driver obviously lied, and I didn't get any sort of fairness, and I certainly wasn't helped. Then I was denied any legal recourse through the courts because no lawyer would actually take up the case. And yet we've got to pay reparations, but it's only going to be us that's paying the reparations. So we are de facto now becoming second-class citizens. The victims on Rochdale, their rights are not protected. And it's only the fact that the globalists are able and are pushing their agenda, the mass immigration and displacement, again, which could be seen as part of a genocidal project, that they're pushing their agenda, and that they're trying to make people feel guilty. And Nicola Sturgeon, the nationalist, is trying to push in this Marxist agenda to make white people hate themselves by pushing this agenda, by not telling the truth about what actually historically happened. Because Nicola Sturgeon's obviously a Marxist globalist shill and not actually a nationalist. So, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. Why would you actually promote this sort of thing in the schools, and false history? False history. These sort of things happen. I think there was only like 30 ships ever was involved, left Scotland involved over I think 200 years period. And it was obviously, as Carl Benjamin pointed out, it was the British that actually had stopped slavery. So, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. But obviously this fits a globalist narrative that they will actually promote this, not protect our own citizens' human rights, but treat them as second-class citizens. Ignore the problem of mass rapes by Muslims in the UK, ignore the fact that there's been nearly 50 mass murder attempts by Muslims in the UK as well, and then try and squint the argument through the controlled media, through, again, like America, only a small number of people owning multiple titles. We don't have disparate journalist, what's the word I'm looking for? Investigative journalism now. We have a controlled journalism, controlled tech that actually allows you, whether or not you fit their narrative, to actually speak. Don't forget, as I said, I've been barred on Facebook. I'm just back on Twitter, although we've actually been barred twice before the American election and the Scottish election. So not only is Jack Dorsey interfering with my right to speak on American issues, but also the right to speak on Scottish issues against Scottish MPs, and speak to them in a manner where they're held to account. So, trillions of pounds wanted for people who may have actually been the product of Islamic and African slavery, enslavement, and setting them against sold as slaves, to the point where white people who have never, based on the dint of being white, this whiteness agenda, which is racist, but the undertones is not about race actually. The undertones is about pushing the Marxist narrative. Again, where everybody will be held down, you won't own anything, you'll be basically like North Korea, and then you'll have this powerful elite of basically technocrats. And that's why they're pushing this underlying critical race theory, which is the oppressed and oppressor. But the oppressor is that obviously the people are pushing the neo-Marxist agenda, who are actually capitalists, but they're corporatists. So they're pushing their corporatist agenda, and they don't want to have the little guy like you and I even have a say in a democratic process. If you look at the UN, not democratically elected. If you look at the EU, 28 unelected commissioners dictating your legislation, not accountable, not elected. They are pushing an undemocratic system of governance on you, and they're trying to guilt trip you with untrue facts into shaming you so that they can actually have de facto open immigration policies and treat you like a second-class citizen in your own country. And that's coming from in here, through the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party could put a stop to this. The Conservative Party are not going to do anything about immigration. They're not going to deport illegal immigrants, and we'll just get young men coming in, walking into the country, and basically once they're here, that's them. They're not going to get deported because that's not their agenda. And what we're going to get, they're able to walk into the country in the middle of a pandemic, whereas we are held in our house for 18 months, not able to reproduce, not be able to go on dates, develop relationships. And that then has a knock-on effect on our birth rates, and the actual replacement agenda by the globalists are obviously what they're actually looking to do. So, I mean, they could de facto be in breach of the UN, which is again not elected but does control international law for some strange reason, own diktats. And that's the point. I mean, to be allowing children to be groomed, raped, and they're not even deporting convicted Pakistani Muslim rapists back to the country of origin because their human rights have to be protected. Yet, when it came to me being in a Muslim country, I was allowed to basically starve in the street, where the so-called British government would not have actually protected my rights. You're becoming a second-class citizen in your own country.